Hello, I'm Benjamin Miss, and this is Introduction to Psychology. Today we are talking about development, and there's a lot of different things we can discuss here. So, we want to define what human development is, obviously, and look at why we would care about studying it. Why is it important? We'll look at childhood and kind of understand that our views are based on our changing views of childhood. So there's been a lot of kind of, understanding of who children are, and then development and ways of measuring that, and then some of the bigger kind of picture debates that go on about child development. So we start by looking at when we study development, we tend to study some certain big chunks of this, like the segments. Prenatal is pretty easy to define because it's basically conception through birth. The onset of infancy is easy to define, but then early childhood and infancy tend to have this like around two split. So to define like a child that's almost two as an infant might seem a little strange, but it's just the way that we do this. And this early childhood period seems to coincide really solidly with language. Middle childhood, right, from the end of that through school until adolescence, where you have puberty through like legal adulthood, and then early, middle, and later adulthood with some fairly, somewhat arbitrary kind of defined ways of looking at what these cutoffs are. So when we look at prenatal development, we talk about a few things like, genes, because this is very influential in like the nature and nurture discussion, how we deal with health, and things like teratogens, which are toxins, anything that's bad for the developing human. The time course is very specific, and you can actually see, issues caused by problems at different times in the time course. When you look at that second stage, this infancy to birth stage, what you're looking at is the job of, not just the prenatal human, but the developing, early human, is to grow their brain. Like that's it. A newborn is not capable of much. They eat, they sleep, they poop, and that's kind of it. They grow their brains. That's the key, is to maintain good health, good nutrition, good rest. And then, we're not quite looking at language development. This is interesting because we see this, right? A lot of kind of stimulation and play. But the language development part really begins in this early childhood stage, where we start talking about relationships, interactions, and beginning education. But 2 to 6 is when they are developing their language. And by the time a child is about 4.5 to 5, they've pretty much mastered their native language in most cases. And really kind of started this early education. 6 is a little arbitrary. But we're looking into the next segment too, which is, ends around puberty and really deals with this kind of, focus on education and exploration, children kind of finding their way. And often these are the pleasant, easy to deal with kids, right? They were able to inhibit their impulses, right? Because that starts around 6. They really kind of get that ability down to not, pick up a stick, look at the stick, and then hit somebody with it because it's a stick. They just kind of are able to do that. And before puberty, when you start to see, another new lack of inhibition, this 12 to 18 range is where you see these major changes. You see a large a brain growth, a body growth, dealing with hormones, looking more toward a little bit of career, and you start to see, maybe pushing against certain boundaries. Again, some of this is interesting because adolescent rebellion isn't a global. It doesn't have to happen. A lot of it has to do with family relationships and the individual. We look at early adulthood, right? Now, this cutoff, again, is arbitrary because 18, the end of adolescence is legal adulthood, right? And so when we're looking at early adulthood, what we're really talking about is college, employment, and kind of beginning families. And we'll see how some theorists have discussed this. Middle adulthood gets into focus on career and family, and also looking into creativity and the importance of feeling as if you are, engaged in something creative, useful, And what happens if you don't get that, right? This, again, fairly arbitrary cutoff, that 35 to 64, different textbooks will have different numbers, 25, 40, whatever. But later adulthood is generally seen as 65 because that's traditional retirement age. I know that that's no longer quite the case, but the idea here is looking at, the dependence, going from being independent to the possibility of dependence, decline, and lots of variability here. You have plenty of people in their 70s who are working. You have plenty of people in their 70s who are just not even present. So there's a lot of variability in this age group. In fact, the variability in human difference increases with age, where like 1-year-olds are extremely similar, right? But 60-year-olds are really quite different. So I asked early on, like, why do we study this? Why do we care about lifespan development? And the answer is it has a large effect on our understanding of psychology. It's the basic framework for advanced topics. And we're also looking at dealing with children. Like if you want to have children, if you want to work with children, it's extremely important to understand how development works. And we'll talk about, lifespan, but a lot of the work has been on children. And in fact, there's different courses if you're interested in psychology. There's child development and lifespan development. And then there's a lot of different ways to look at these things. If you end up studying education, there's very specific things in regards to what you may study. Now, I want to get into the history of childhood because this is just fascinating. And when we look at these images, right, we see massive variability in how children were treated in terms of, what was expected of them. But we also see a similarity in these two images. And that is these children are being seen as just miniature versions of adults. And that was a very traditional way, like early, when we get to kind of like, early farming, and industrialization, you see children, it's basically, okay, you are able to work, go get a job, go do something. And this has been really quite a change in attitude over time. When you see this kind of history of, children engaged in mining, textiles, for instance, was a big thing. A lot of things that children were doing, and it's not done today. In fact, child labor is legal in the United States under certain circumstances, and the major circumstance is it your parents' business, right? So, for instance, farming, it's still not uncommon. But there's a difference between, children helping out and children expected to work. And what does this mean for their development? What does this mean for their education? And that's been a big issue. And one of the things you see is that until the 19th century, this is the mid 1800s, there were no laws about child labor. And these early laws are just baffling. Basically, children 14 to 18 could work 12 hours a day, and there was no work on day offs, but they had to get a lunch break. And 9 to 13-year-olds couldn't work more than 8 hours a day, and you had to give them 2 hours of school. I mean, a 9-year-old working an 8-hour job and having school for 2 hours, that sounds insane from our modern perspective. But a lot of this was based on the needs, like what was required, what was, and we'll look at those variables, in treatment. This is from the United States, from the 19th century and early 20th century in terms of, children working in the mills, and, they were small, they could, work these machines. They, were had to work in order to, make money to help support themselves and their family. And when you look at child labor in the globe, we see that, though this is incomplete, not all countries report. Like the United States doesn't report. We're like, oh no, we're too good. Because you do have it. We would be yellow, less than 10%, because again, it is legal under various circumstances, like, for instance, family business. But in some areas, you see much higher rates of this. And sadly, the greatest areas of child labor are things like cocoa production, right? Chocolate, mining, and textiles. A lot of the clothes that we wear are from these places. And people get into all sorts of arguments. They say things like, well, if they didn't work, then they would starve. So at least they have a job, so they can buy food. And clearly that's maybe the case, but you look at the kind of structural situation that leads to, a 9-year-old having to, you know, risk their lives mining in order to eat and survive, and you're clearly looking at a very problematic situation. Um, so we talk about, the U.S. and kind of the Western view and the industrialized view, but there's a lot of change. And what's really interesting is that when we consider child labor, it seems that one of the worst things for humans was civilization, right? In terms of like farming and the development of cities and then industrialization. Because when you look at the few remaining tribes that have been studied, the hunter-gatherer type tribes that exist, they do fine. I mean, there's a very different view of children. There's a lot more kind of like adult presence, family presence, nurturing, support. It's a very different kind of lifestyle. So we may be missing out on certain benefits of modern medicine, some of the comforts we have, but it's certainly when it comes to children and what they want, that's the involvement. And when you look at the variability in treatment, you look at economic need, investment in the child, right, and the belief in the nature of humanity. So those are the big ones. There's plenty of variables, but one, if it's basically kid works or family starves, kid's going to work. There's not really any question there, right? If there's no need for that, if the family has lots of resources, then you may very much see a different kind of situation. Investment in the child can be due to the philosophy on having children, having 1 or 2 children and focusing on their development versus having, a dozen children and hoping a few of them get themselves together and figure it out. It's a big difference. I'm not saying you can't invest in large numbers of children. I'm just saying it's harder. It's harder to spend that time nurturing large numbers of children, and having older children take care of younger children is also quite really problematic for their own attitudes and their own development in many cases. Then you look at the belief in the nature of humanity. Like when you talk about how you treat children, if you look at people as basically being bad and they need to have, the bad whipped out of them, you're going to be much harsher and much more kind of, authoritarian versus the authoritative. And we'll talk about parenting styles, right, where you're kind of like helping the child to learn versus permissive when you're like, oh, they'll be okay. So in looking at these cultural differences, we talk about how are children seen? Are children to be nurtured? Are children to be told what to do? Do they have input? We look at risk behaviors. Some children are going to take more risks, and there's definitely interaction of the child and environment. From early on, children who explore, push boundaries, these are going to have influences on development, right? That are going to come back. Are parents going to, respond harshly? Are they going to like implement more rules? Like how is this going to go? And then you look at, there's problems in some development. There may be some developmental differences or difficulties. All right, so now we get to the first big part here, the big debate of nature versus nurture and continuity versus discontinuity. So when we look at these, nature versus nurture is basically how much of this is genetics and how much of this is the environment creating this, child influencing development. And the other is continuity versus discontinuity, which means, how is this child developing? Is it kind of like the steady growth, or are there clear stages where a child in this stage needs this, child in this stage needs something else? Well, I want to kind of look at how we would consider understanding these things. And this is one of my favorite questions, right? If just tests full of questions like this that require an in-depth reading and analysis. This is from Victor Hugo, who wrote Les Miserables. Men are still men. The despot's wickedness comes of ill teaching and power's excess. Comes the purple he from childhood wears. Slaves would be tyrants if the chance were theirs. What is Victor Hugo's view being expressed here? Is it nature, nurture, continuity, or discontinuity? Well, the answer is this is about nurture, right? So he sees basically that, having opportunity, it's not that these, tyrants are born tyrants. It's that having this power, being born to the throne creates this tyrannical attitude. Then you have this one. Information processing theory believes that we learn incrementally, but there are no big changes in human development. For instance, memory increases a little bit at a time, but without any major jumps in processing power. What would their arguments support? Nature, nurture, continuity, or discontinuity? Well, what they're talking about is continuity. And the information processing theory of development believes very much in a continuous stream of development where, you do see these subtle changes, right? But there's nothing like huge happening that's causing, some massive change in thinking. So the information processing theory is more like, more like this. So you've got, think about like, a computer, right? So you've got video games. All right, think about this. You may have seen those big video game consoles that had maybe like Pac-Man or Space Invaders or something like from back in the 70s, where you had, and maybe early 80s, where you had, this huge console that played one game, and it was very, very simple. You could go back and forth, you could go, on a grid or whatever it was, but it was a very simple game. You compare that to maybe, an Atari system, where there are a bunch of different games and you could do more stuff, and you compare that to something like VR, like a modern VR gaming system. Looking at these things may appear discontinuous. It may appear like, oh my, these are very, very different, and yet they're all based on the same technology. The difference is increases in computing power, increases in memory, and so you're able to do more with the same kind of stuff. Information processing looks at the brain the same way, not as stages. And a lot of the stuff we talk about is stage theory based because it's a really nice, clean way to understand differences in development. So not going to say information theory is wrong. I'm not going to say stage theories are right, but oftentimes looking at both of these, understanding both these ways of looking at things can be helpful. So we've got this ongoing and constant debate regarding human development. And these are, remember, rationalism versus empiricism, which is basically nature versus nurture, right? And our modern view of, behaviorism, which is the nurture versus the nativism, which is the nature. So there's all these things that have been kind of ongoing in terms of, how children develop. Well, up through the first half of the 20th century, behaviorism reigned, from maybe the 20s up until, the late 50s, everything was learned. And this was important because it influenced everything. Like, hey, education's important, rehabilitation's important. And if everything's learned, then, we need to consider how we invest in people. If genes matter more, then, well, education's not that important. When we look at, this debate between these things, rationalism and empiricism, we look at, what is innate and what is learned. And, we've looked before when we talked about language, the sound categorization, clear and dark L, the L in lip versus the L in pull, where my mouth is doing very different things, and yet I classify both of those sounds as L. In the same way, both the T in top and the T in pop, my mouth is doing very different things, and yet I'm classifying both of these things as T. So this is the idea of domain specific versus domain general. Do we have a classification system that's specific to language, or do we just generally classify things? Children are really good at classifying things. It's a very quick thing that happens. They make these very quick judgments to things. This is like this. Kind of like, the development of, their kind of gender typing. You don't actually have to tell a kid, oh, act like a boy or act like a girl. They're going to identify their gender. They're going to identify adults of their gender, and they're going to make that kind of connection. They're going to do that kind of categorization on their own without being socialized. So when we look at this kind of continuity versus discontinuity, the example of continuity is something like tree growth. A little tree looks like a big tree, just smaller, right? Discontinuous be like a tadpole. A baby tadpole looks like a fish. A grown-up is a frog. You look at the butterfly, right? Incredibly discontinuous. The caterpillar liquefies inside the cocoon and rebuilds into this butterfly. It's a very different type of development. So when we get into this, stage theories represent discontinuous development. Like this stage happens, then this stage happens, and there's some kind of break between them. And we can see clearly some major biological changes happening along critical periods. Things like developing our organization of our perceptual systems, like what happens if you're born blind but get sight 20 years later. What is vision like? I mean, that was an ancient philosophical question. What is the visual experience like for that person? And the answer is they don't have one. They never develop it. If you're born blind, your visual system doesn't organize. So there's nothing to adapt to there. Puberty is very clear. There's a change. Hormone levels change greatly. So as with most things, the logical answer is a little from column A and a little from column B. Here's our frog life cycle. These different things look quite different, and then you get to here, which looks quite different from here. So okay. Recall this. Which psychologist would most agree with the philosopher John Locke that children are a blank slate when born, and everything is learned through sense experience? James, Chomsky, Piaget, or Skinner? Well, the answer here is Skinner, right? The behaviorists. Well, we're going to talk more about this when we get to personality. But for now, we want to look at Freud, just kind of had this overall, leave it to Freud to sexualize the mind of a child, where Freud saw, the early development as these different stages. So really, he gave us this early stage theory, and a lot of stage theories grew out of this. He did have the value of looking at the influence of childhood experience on adult behavior, the unconscious. We still talk about the id, ego, and superego, though these are often used incorrectly. But you get this kind of foundational thing, and we'll talk about the oral, anal, phallic, stages when we talk about personality, because that's what Freud was talking about, was the influence of these stages on that. So you've got the psychosocial crises that come from Erikson, right? So based on Freud, but expanded greatly and less focused on the sexual and more on this social, right? So what did we need? So he came up with these 8 periods where these 8 developmental periods that were basically, you see, they kind of line up to those stages, those general areas, not perfectly, but you get the idea of what happens and what do we need as we develop. So the first stage is trust versus mistrust. And what we see here is children need to develop a sense that their caregivers will take care of them. When the baby cries, they need to know that the caregiver is going to come and feed them, hold them, change them, whatever it is, right? Because you think about it, I mean, they're uncomfortable, they cry, they don't know what they need. There was a movement a while back where they were trying to teach, really young infants to cry it out, right? Which is, the 4-month-old is just trying to manipulate us. It needs to go to sleep and cry. A horrific idea. Here you've got like a tiny infant that's vomiting from stress because it wants someone to pick it up. It wants that, and the parents are just trying to tune it out because they think they're helping it by teaching it to comfort itself. I mean, once you hit 6 months, you can definitely start doing that. But I mean, they were trying it with much too small infants. And even then, you need to look at the individual, right? And this is an important point in child, development and raising children. There's differences, and what works for one may not work for another. Well, Erickson's argument was, if this, little human that can't fend for itself can't trust the caregiver, it's always going to struggle with this. The next stage is autonomy versus shame and doubt. And this is where they're needing to develop muscle control and the ability to, to try things and to be successful. And if they don't get it, they will feel shame. Next, we see initiative versus guilt, which is this need to explore. The children try to exert power and they want to, feel success, but they're going to have trouble. And if the adult kind of comes down too hard, they may feel guilty. So there's a balance here, allowing the child to explore and try things without, never letting them have this opportunity, right? Then you have industry versus inferiority, this next big range here, which is school, right? Are they able to keep up with their peers? Are they able to succeed and do a good job? Are they going to feel competent, or are they going to feel inferior? The next stage is identity versus identity confusion. This is the adolescent stage, right? Where people try things out. Maybe one year somebody's dressing all in black, and the next year their focus is on some athletic team. It's fine. I mean, we want to encourage exploration. We want to encourage, sure, see what works, and what fits. They need to develop a sense of self in terms of maybe what they want to do for work, how they define their sex and sexuality, their own political and religious beliefs. These are really quite difficult and need to be encouraged for the individual to explore these things. Now, the big stage we see, college and early adulthood, we see this intimacy versus isolation, where the big event here is relationships, specifically love relationships, but relationships in general. What are people doing with their time? Are you working and then, going to school and then going home and not being around people, or are you engaged? Like, what's actually, happening here, right? So that's what we're looking at in terms of these, are we connecting to others or not? Intimacy doesn't have to be about sex or romance. Intimacy is just about, vulnerability and opening to people versus feeling isolated and disconnected. Now, another long period here is this generativity versus stagnation, where you see, the major life events of middle age are work and parenting, this middle adulthood age. And, what is your engagement? This need to create, right? Create and nurture and feel as if you're generating, feel as if you're creating versus just feeling kind of stuck. Do you know people who maybe they just kind of hate their job and they're not happy in their lives and they're just kind of miserable? There's a lot of ways to be involved, but people do kind of feel stuck, like they need to do certain things. Then you see the final stage, Erickson's integrity versus despair, which is looking back. How do you feel about things? Do you feel, hey, this worked? I feel a solid sense of self, of who I am. Or do you feel that kind of bitter regret of failure, of things not going the way you'd hoped, a life that just didn't work out? In each of these things, we are very different in each of these stages as we age, as we kind of go through them. So Erickson's stage theory is very much about the social side. Now I want to talk about the cognitive side and the developmental side, in terms of the mind. And the two key figures that we generally talk about here are Piaget and Vygotsky. And we tend to spend a lot more time on Piaget. And a lot of that is because of the differences in these two individuals, right? So what was it about Piaget? Piaget was like us in terms of Western. He was Swiss. His world was like ours to a certain extent. He studied his own children's development, and he saw them as active, learning lessons on their own, and intrinsically motivated to learn. Now, both Piaget and Vygotsky could be considered constructivists in the sense that children need to construct a world and knowledge for themselves, right? Construct their understanding. They're not, are you an empty vessel where your job as a student is to sit there quietly while the professor just shares this wonderful wisdom with you, and then boom, you have the knowledge? No, I would lose my mind if I was a student in a classroom for all this time and had no engagement, no involvement. Watching videos is probably, well, pretty boring for a lot of people, right? Because we don't have that engagement. Still, for some people, I know that, I like podcasts, and to kind of listen and learn and kind of repeat it in that way could be cool. But I hope you got activities. I hope you're having, assignments and things to complete. So Piaget also lived quite a bit longer than Vygotsky, which was another big influence too, right? He had a lot more time to have this impact. So one of the things Piaget gives us is called the false belief test. So here's Sally and Anne, right? And this is the example, right? The key here is this. Sally puts, something somewhere that Anne sees, right? Then after Sally leaves the room, Anne moves it. When Sally comes back into the room, where does she look? Now, as an adult, this seems like this is a stupid question, right? Sally put the ball in the basket, Anne moved it to the box, but Sally doesn't know that, so Sally's going to look in the basket. But what would a 3-year-old say? A 3.5-year-old is probably going to say Sally's going to look in the box, because the little child, the 3.5-year-old, doesn't realize that the mind is separate, right? That basically we have separate minds. In the same way, try to get a 3-year-old to share. Good luck with that, right? They don't understand. They think, well, if I want this toy, then you want me to have this toy too. That's the way they view it. They don't understand that there's this, difference in what we want. And only when they develop what we call theory of mind are they able to really, engage on that level. And theory of mind is very likely one of the biggest things that makes us, humans, right? It's this really kind of special thing in order to say, look, if I need to work with you, I need to read your mind. So we may be bad at mind reading, right? Your ex may have expected, some serious mind reading from you, but you get the idea. Like, we're still pretty good at reading people and interacting. So Piaget divided these stages, and we see the theory of mind would develop during this pre-operational stage. But let me just go through these 4 stages and show you more about them, right? The sensory motor stage is the first stage, where you have this early birth of 2 years, which is about coordinating your senses and your movements, right? So it's okay. Here's my senses, touch, exploration, interaction, and coordinating the body. Like early on, I mean, if you've ever seen like a newborn, they're just flailing. You know what I mean? Oh, they hit themselves in the face again, and then they find their feet, and it's this amazing thing where they're all excited, like, oh, these are a thing, and they're attached to me, right? So pre-operational is when they really start to represent the world. They start to come up with these things, and this is when you develop language too. Part of this ability to represent the world. You see this development of theory of mind that's happening at this time, where they're, able to understand these things. Also, you see children at this stage who have trouble with this, right? They're not really able to get this idea of conservation. And there's different parts of these deductive reasoning things, right? So look, in this picture here, the idea is there were these 2 cups. They were the same, right? This cup, on the left, and this cup on the right. Then the adult took the cup here on the right and poured it into this tall one. And then you say to the child, which cup, tell me about these cups. Does one cup have more than the other? Does one cup have less? Or are they the same? And a child about this child's age will probably look at these and say, well, this one has more. And the reason for that is they think that it's taller, right? And so what they're doing is fixating on one thing, right? This idea of centration, where they can only consider one aspect of something at a time, and they can't do reversibility. They can't undo it. They can't imagine that they didn't get their way and they're never going to get their way, right? Classification. These children are developing, concrete operational, but they're not quite there. Where you say, there's 10 flowers here. There's 5 of them are red, and 6 of them are red, and 4 of them are yellow. Yeah, I can math. And you say, are there more flowers or more red flowers? And they just have a hard time understanding what that means. And they'll often say, oh, there's more red flowers. And then seriation, logical order. Can you put things into order from largest to smallest, from darkest to lightest, along different kinds of things? Well, these are part of this process of developing, this kind of concrete operational, classifying things, understanding events, are influenced by multiple factors, that there's more than one possible reason for things. They become able to think logically. And then in the last stage, this formal operations, they begin to think systematically and start to understand things like politics and ethics. And they start to like things like, science fiction, because they can imagine these possible worlds. They can engage in scientific reasoning. And of course, not everyone's doing this at the same level. Now, Piaget is a fantastically interesting individual, highly intelligent, was writing scientific papers in high school, and just an absolutely, fascinating individual. So, we kind of get that with some of these early founders of areas in psychology. So there's a lot of debate about Piaget's, stages, tests. But what's true is that he's done had a really good kind of base for understanding development. So we look at these processes that propel development, right? Assimilation, accommodation, and equilibration, right? Which is kind of like developing this equilibrium between these things. So when we look at, how these work, this is part of Piaget's continuity, because Piaget wasn't just discontinuity, just stages. He was also, well, there's things happening along here. So new information comes in. We have to translate it into something we can understand. Then you've got accommodation, where you actually have so much information coming in that is changing the way you view the world that you actually have to accommodate and change the way you view things, change the way you represent things, And we kind of balance between these things. The focus, however, is generally on Piaget's discontinuity, which is these distinct hierarchical stages. This kind of focus of qualitative change. There's a difference, a fundamental difference between stage 1 and stage 2. Broad applicability. Time, context doesn't matter. The transitions are fast and the sequences are invariant. Now, what's interesting is when you actually look at the issues here is it turns out that it's not quite so simple, right? Piaget definitely, had these really cool ideas and a lot of it worked, but if you ask Piaget's questions differently sometimes, use video examples, try to make it more concrete, kids are able to answer above what their level should be according to Piaget. So there's definitely changes in things. Now, Vygotsky's focus was different because Vygotsky was influenced by the rise of the Soviet Union and the Bolshevik Revolution. So he and Piaget were around at the same time. And late in Vygotsky's career, him and Piaget were actually communicating and discussing their ideas. And so, often we say, oh, these are very different, but it was just different ways of looking at things. And I think they agreed in a lot of areas on development. So we consider, what Vygotsky saw as the focus, which was the social process, right? How learning was a social affair, and he witnessed this incredibly rapid change. He was just really witnessing industrialization. This brings up another point. Our views of how development works, our views of all these things is really influenced by our place in time, right? These researchers, when you look at, where they were from, what their experiences were like, it makes sense. Their beliefs make sense in that framework. So then we look at the idea of the social origin of the mind, where its interaction is required. He thought that speech was required, in terms of developing an active, thoughtful mind. And he created what's called the zone of proximal development, which is a really cool idea that relates to what the learner can do with guidance. So basically, a child is capable of maybe some basic addition and subtraction. They can't do multiplication and division on their own, but when they're with a teacher who's framing things in a certain way and working them through it, they can do it, right? You may have had this experience. I've seen this in stats classes where students come in and they're like, oh yeah, I got this. This makes sense. And they're doing it great in class. And then they leave class and they're like, I have no idea what's going on, right? They kind of lose that. They need that environment. They need that connection. And the zone of proximal development is, can we create a learning environment where you can learn together? And then there's always going to be things outside it that even together they're not ready for. This is Vygotski's most well-known idea. Well, while this is all kind of going on, behaviorism is also in full swing in the United States, right? We can't get enough of this behaviorism, right? Because it's so involved in things, right? And so we look at how things were changing and how things kind of, went from there, where the influence was on, very heavily on nurture up until the cognitive revolution in the 1960s. All right, here's some questions for you. Who developed the phallic and latent stages of development? We only talked about this very briefly. And this was Freud, Piaget, Vygotsky, or Erikson. It was Freud. Who talked about concrete operations and formal operations? And this was Piaget. And who talked about development in terms of psychosocial crises? This was Erikson. I got another one of these questions that I love so much, right? So this is from Good Omens by Gaiman and Pratchett. The quote is this: "Don't tell me from genetics what they've got to do with it," said Crowley. "Look at Satan, created as an angel, grows up to be the great adversary. Hey, if you're going to go on about genetics, you might as well say the kid will grow up to be an angel. After all, his father was really big in heaven in the old days. Saying he'll grow up to be a demon is like saying a mouse with its tail cut off will give birth to tailless mice. No, upbringing is everything. Take it from me." Who would agree with this? Freud, Piaget, Skinner, or Chomsky? Who would most agree with this? The answer is Skinner. This is all about behaviorism. This is all about learning, right? Why is this character who they are? Well, it's not the genetics, right? It's got to be the learning. So now our next segment, and this is our next big segment, is moral development. So we look at how cognitive development is influencing moral decision making. And there's a very famous example from Piaget, who had his same kind of theories here, where he said, okay, here's two scenarios. And one scenario, the child steals a roll for his friend from a baker. And the other scenario, a child steals a ribbon for herself. And Piaget says which child was worse, right? Is one better than the other? And we look at this as an adult, we tend to see, well, little Jean Valjean here stealing the roll for his starving friend, like that's a lot, less. We may still agree that stealing's wrong, but I mean, the motivation was certainly better than, stealing the ribbon for oneself. And yet, we think about what might a child focus on. And the child here argues that what the boy did was wrong because of, again, that centration. 6-year-old not being able to focus on more than one aspect, simply focuses on the size of the item, sees that the roll is bigger, and says, well, therefore, that's what's wrong, right? So Piaget's theory was based on these early kind of stages, but it was Kohlberg who really took on these and did a lot of work on moral development. So first, up until the time the child fails the false belief task, they believe the parent knows everything they do. So if the parent knows everything that this child does, then there is no morality, it's simply behavior. But then up from 5 to 10, Kohlberg believed that it was still other directed. Rules are handed down from authority, and they're just trying to keep from getting punished. Well, there's a very famous story that Kohlberg used. It's called the Heinz's Dilemma. And so a woman's near death from cancer. There's a drug that might save her, but the druggist is charging a lot for it. I try to make the numbers understandable for from our standpoint. So the druggist paid $40,000 for the research, design, and materials, but is charging $400,000 for the drug. The sick woman's husband wants to try to borrow the money, but he can only get half of the cost. He told the druggist says, nope, you've got to pay the full amount. And then Heinz considers breaking into the store to steal the drug. Well, should Heinz steal the drug? That's the question. And the answer here, first of all, you have to answer yes or no. Okay, so you look at the scenario and you say, think about how you would answer. And it's a little tough because how you answer it's going to be influenced by, your experience. Think of somebody, if you're not married to someone you love, think of somebody that you love, that if something happened to them, what would you do? What lengths would you go to, and then answer, should Heinz steal the drug? Then explain why. Why did you give that answer? And that's the important part, because what we care about is not yes or no. What we care about is why. So here's our different stages according to Kohlberg. You got pre-conventional, which is based on the individual's own needs and perceptions. Conventional, which is based on society's expectations and our laws. And post-conventional, which is based on abstract, personal principles. So the goal is to say, okay, which of these is which, and how do these things work? Well, what's interesting is as we go through these stages, one of the things, and there's sub-stages in here too, but they're still kind of general in terms of this. Pre-conventional is before age 12, the younger, how can I avoid punishment? What's in it for me? That kind of orientation. And then you've got the, conventional, which is before age 18, which is, what's, kind of society's expectations. And then you kind of go through all of these various stages. And so I just want to show you the graph, right? So here's the issue. When you look at stage, the various stages, right? You've got your few are reaching the higher stages. All right. So here's our human rights stage 5, right? Nobody's at stage 6. So what does that say for stage 6? What does that mean? So the early stuff, obedience is pretty quick, right? And then you've got this what's in it for me, self-interest stage 2, and then you've got this conformity, what does society want? How am I supposed to behave stage 3? And you see as with age. So this was a really cool study that followed for 26 years, right? Early on, the 10-year-olds were mostly in self-interest and obedience. And then you see this quick rise in conformity. By 16, 60% of the population is functioning at conformity, which is stage 3. And then by 32, the majority of the population is either conformity or law and order. These are the laws, we follow them, boom. Or this is what how we're supposed to act, Then we look down here at stage 5 and nothing for stage 6, human rights. And you also see, look at this stage 2. There's still some older people that are functioning at that what's in it for me orientation. Now here's the problems with Kohlberg. Few reach the higher stages. That's a problem. Gender bias. These were geared toward males. Cultural bias, very Western view. What about cultures that value conformity? Where that's like one of the highest values of the culture. And then situational factors. If you have no connection or no love relationship and you're just thinking about this abstract dude Hines, it's very easy to be like, I don't really care what he does. I guess he should steal it or not. But if you think about somebody that you love dying in that situation, all of a sudden it becomes a very different attitude. And I think that's the key. I mean, there's a big factors and difference here. So those are the problems with Kohlberg, and there's better ways of doing this. So in pre-conventional morality, is judgment based on an individual's own needs or perception? Is this true or false? Judgment is based on an individual's own needs and perception. And the answer is true. What about conventional morality? Judgment can be based on beliefs about universal ethics. This one is false, right? The universal stuff is the, post-conventional, stages 5 and 6. Well, there's a newer way of looking at this. This is Nancy Eisenberg's pro-social moral judgment. And what we're looking at here is some of these ways of looking at, development. So she came up with scenarios that were about, kind of like pro-social meaning for society, like helping society. This is in contrast to antisocial, which means against society. I know. We tend to think like, oh, antisocial just means no, I don't like being around people. I just want to be by myself, which no, right? That's the pop view, but the technical meaning of antisocial is basically you are against society, you're a criminal, you probably are committing crimes. So creating these scenarios like helping by getting an injured child parents versus going to a friend's party, where a young child may not be able to think past their self-focus, where they think like, oh, I have this present I have to deliver. What happens if I don't deliver the present? They're not able to see other things. Then keeping food after a flood versus giving food to others where hunger would be an issue, but nobody would die without food. So there's these different ways of viewing of these different scenarios. And Eisenberg came up with these stages, and I'll go through each of them. So this is just the summary, but here we start with stage 1, the hedonistic, self-focused preschool, younger elementary school kids. All they care about is pursuing their own pleasure. Then you get a lot of these kids into this stage where all of a sudden they become these little saints, where a child might bring, give another child who's hungry their lunch. And then 2 hours later, they're like, oh, wait, I gave my lunch away. I'm hungry now. So I have needs, somebody fulfill my needs. They're very focused on, well, you need this. Okay. Right. They want to help. They're very sensitive. Then you get to this kind of approval or stereotyped, which is, elementary, some high school, where you have these stereotyped views of good or bad, like what is good supposed to be? What is bad supposed to be? How are you being? Then we get into this, and this is why I like Eisenberg more. You get into this stage of self-reflective empathic, which is basically what happens when you say, helping other people feels good. Hurting people feels bad. You just get this kind of idea that empathy starts to develop. And this influences morality, and this kind of gets into the whole, Phoebe, Joey from Friends, where Joey's arguing there's no such thing as a good deed, because if you're helping people and it feels good, therefore, that's not a good deed. You're doing something for you. Then you get to the transitional, which is kind of between this and your internalized values. And these strongly internalized values, the final stage, are high school, older, but it's not as common. And it's living up to one's strongly internalized values. And a lot of people go back and forth because things can be very situational, things very justified. You look at certain ways of viewing the world and you see it. All right, so now let's go all the way back to early development. All right, we're coming full circle now, and we're looking at some very early stages here. So what are the early stages? These are some terminology things. You've heard the word maybe embryo and fetus. But the difference is you don't become an embryo until after week 2. Before week 2, you have not implanted, right? So basically you have a fertilized egg, a zygote, becomes a blastocyst, which is, dividing cells, but still not growing, because you don't grow until you implant on the side of the uterus and start to get nutrients from the mother, which then is used for growth. and that's when the placenta develops. And then the fetal stage, around 2 months, you end the embryonic stage and enter the fetal stage, where you um, maintain the rest of time during your development. During this time, we consider the health and teratogen issues, and you see things like the dangers of drugs and alcohol and smoking. Smoking, on average, lowers birth rate half a pound. That is massive when you consider the development of the brain and everything that's happening at that time. Teratogens are particularly dangerous during critical or sensitive periods. Damage can happen before someone's aware of pregnancy. Say, the first month, like weeks 4, maybe week 5, someone's taking a lot of toxins, and this is a very early brain organization. You notice a lot of people, when they're trying to become pregnant, they will avoid alcohol. They'll do all sorts of things to be healthy, taking vitamins and stuff, how important that is. We also have these instinctual reflexes, the grasping reflex, where if you press, they'll grab. The Moro reflex, where if you put them down butt first and then head first, they'll flail. And the stepping reflex, if you hold them, they'll actually do this. There's some ingrained reflexes, automatic things that are kind of helping with development. At birth, they have a strong sense of smell and poor vision, and a decent sense of hearing. Now, as we've kind of looked at development, we also look at what's called attachment. It's extremely important in development, right? So we have Harlow. Harlow was the one who had the monkeys, right? So Harlow had the monkeys with the cloth mother or the wire mother. And if you study development, there's so much cool information here. You'll go into much more depth here. So what happened was Harlow wanted to see if there was a difference. And so when given the choice between a cloth mother and a wire mother, basically both of these were inanimate dolls. One was just chicken wire, one was actually covered with cloth. The baby monkey would choose the cloth. I think this is kind of a silly experiment, and the part that really matters was the outcome, which was, okay, sure, we do see that when faced with a strange situation or fear, the monkey would run back. So this did show the need for connection and attachment. The problem was, all these monkeys, when they grew up, were freaking nuts. All right, they didn't know how to interact with other monkeys. They would hurt their own children. They didn't understand how to mate. They were in bad shape. So they had isolation. They were basically raised in isolation without contact. And we see the takeaway being how freaking important early contact is. Lots of love, lots of care. And John Bowlby, went into that too. So Bowlby grew up kind of like upper class, where it was believed that the parents weren't supposed to show their children much love. And he was basically raised by nannies, and when his nanny went away, it was like traumatic for him, right? This broken attachment. And Bowlby spent a lot of time studying, the need for attachment in this early kind of connection. One of the things that was observed was this massive number in orphanages. When orphanages were overfull during the Great Depression, especially with newborns, a large number of them died. They weren't killed. They just weren't loved enough. They weren't held. There was nobody to take care of them when they cried. So they were getting enough food and getting changed, but you basically had one caregiver was running between cribs trying to take care of all these infants, and they just weren't getting enough of this connection. It was tough. So he created this idea of attachment types, and Ainsworth kind of went off from there. And this idea of need for secure attachment. And Ainsworth created a strange situation, which was a way to test this by taking a small child, putting them into a room with their caregiver, and then having their caregiver, another adult, come in and the caregiver leave the room, and seeing how the caregiver responded. So a secure attachment means the child prefers the caregiver to a stranger. The parent's a secure base. When you have The avoidant, you have the unresponsive to the parent, parents not used to secure base. Resistant is clingy. They reject attempts to interact, and disorganized is odd behavior. And seen in many abused children, but these are really fascinating to study. And you go into much more depth if you study human development. Absolutely fantastic to look at these different types of attachment and how it relates to parenting styles. So how we develop a view of self. You recognize yourself in the mirror around 18 months. And then we get into parenting styles. So it is generally believed that the best parenting style, the one that is most beneficial to children's outcome, is called authoritative. And it's a little tricky because it sounds like the other one, authoritarian. Authoritative is the adult that talks to the kid, the adult that considers the kid's viewpoint in making rules, but also makes sure the kids understands the needs for limits, right? This adult expresses warmth, affection, and is flexible, says, okay, I see your point of view. This promotes high self-esteem and strong social skills. The authoritarian parent is the parent who is my way or the highway, the parent who says, these are the rules, follow the rules, and you will obey. Children here are often anxious and unhappy. The permissive parent just is kind of whatever, let the kid do whatever they want. Very poor self-discipline in the children. They engage in risky behavior, tend to have low grades. And the uninvolved parent, these are indifferent. They're just checked out. And these children are withdrawn, afraid. They don't know how to connect. Well, what's interesting is parenting matters in terms of the temperament. Some children may be easy, difficult, or slow to warm up. And you came out this way. When you were born, you were one of these as infants, right, as newborns. Within a very short time, easy babies start to regulate, right? They're sleeping at the same time, eating, excreting, and having a fairly decent cycle. Difficult babies, they don't. They're all over the place. They have difficulty adapting. They're a much greater challenge. Caregivers are going to behave differently between these children, between these newborns because of the needs. And then you have slow to warm up that's kind of in between. But they're going to elicit different parenting styles, receive different levels of warmth. And so when we look at, all these great debates, nature versus nurture, we see right here that you come out with certain nature. And the best laid plans of nurture can be thrown off by nature. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our discussion of development, and I look forward to future discussions. Thank you.